You know, there are stories that get told in the light of day, the kind you see in movies. Clear heroes, clear villains, and a big mission accomplished banner at the end. And then, well, then there are the other stories. The ones whispered in the back of a smoky VFW hall at 2 in the morning, or shared between two guys who haven't slept in 48 hours because they know what happens when they close their eyes. I've seen my share of combat. I've walked patrol routes where the terrain wanted to kill you just as bad as the enemy did. But what I'm about to tell you, it's not about a firefight. It's not about politics or that domino theory crap. It's about a team of highly trained men who went into a place that wasn't on any map, looking for an enemy they knew how to fight, and finding something else entirely. Something that had been waiting there a lot longer than we had. I want you to picture the end before we even start. Picture a ladder dangling from the belly of a Huey slick, swinging wildly in the rotor wash above a triple canopy jungle that looks like a bruised ocean of green. There's a man on that ladder, a sergeant named Miller. He's not climbing. He's hanging on with one arm, his boots scrambling for purchase on the rungs, while his other hand is firing a CAR-15 rifle straight down into the trees. And he isn't firing controlled bursts. He's just dumping the magazine. And down there, in the gloom of the undergrowth, something is moving. It's not a squad of NVA regulars. It's not a tiger. It's a pale, muscular shape, massive and fast, leaping between the branches with a fluidity that defies physics. It's looking up at the helicopter. And it's screaming, not in pain, but in rage. To understand how Miller got to that ladder, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand where this happened. In late 1970, the war in Vietnam was a chaotic, sprawling mess, but there was another war happening next door. They called it the Secret War. Laos. Officially neutral, which meant the United States officially had no combat troops on the ground. But we all know official doesn't mean much when supply lines are at stake. The Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through those mountains like an artery, pumping weapons and men into the south. To stop it, the brass needed eyes on the ground. They needed men who didn't exist, fighting a war that wasn't happening, in a place they weren't allowed to be. That's where Recon Team Vector came in. I've read the after-action reports. I've seen the redacted files where entire paragraphs are blacked out with heavy ink. But more importantly, I've heard the tapes. The voice of the radio telephone operator, a kid named Davis, cracking over the static, trying to describe something his training had never prepared him for. The team was small, tight, lethal. You had Miller, the 1-0, the team leader. He was a lifer, the kind of Green Beret who checked his gear 3 times before he checked his own pulse. Pragmatic, hard-nosed, didn't believe in ghosts. Then there was Davis, the 1-1, carrying the radio and the weight of the world on his back. Sully was the heavy weapons man, carrying an M60 machine gun that he treated like a newborn baby. And finally, there was Kiet, an indigenous scout, a local recruited from the hill tribes. He knew the jungle better than any American ever could. He could smell the enemy before he saw them. But on this mission, Kiet was different. From the moment we got the briefing, he was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. The mission sounded simple enough on paper. Insert into a remote valley in the Kamawane province, a jagged landscape of limestone karsts. Those are massive stone towers that shoot straight up out of the jungle floor like rotten teeth. Intel said the NVA were using the valley as a truck park, a place to hide vehicles during the day to avoid American bombers. Vector's job was to go in, confirm the location, call in the airstrikes, and get out. Standard recon. The insertion was a white-knuckle ride. Chopper pilots flew low, hugging the nap of the earth to stay under the radar. Doors open, wind whipping through the cabin, smelling of aviation fuel and wet vegetation. I know that smell. It sticks to you. Smells like rot and life all mixed together. When the bird flared for the landing zone, it didn't touch down. Grass was too tall, ground too uneven. We jumped the last few feet, boots hitting the mud, weapons up, scanning the tree line. The chopper pulled pitch and roared away, the sound of the rotors fading until it was swallowed by the jungle. And that's when the first thing went wrong. Usually, when a helicopter leaves, the jungle takes a minute to reset. Monkeys start screaming again, birds call out, insects start their buzz. It's a wall of noise. But when the bird left Team Vector, there was nothing. No monkeys. No birds. Just the wind rustling the bamboo and the distant hum of the extraction bird fading away. Davis noted it in his log immediately. He wrote, "LZ cold. Too cold. Silence is heavy." Miller didn't like it either. I can imagine him standing there, sweat already darkening his tiger stripe fatigues, signaling for the team to move off the X. You never stay on the landing zone. That's a good way to get mortared. We moved into the tree line, melting into the shadows. The terrain in that part of Laos is a nightmare. Not flat. It's a series of steep ridges and deep ravines, covered in vines tough as wire and thorns that can punch through canvas. We moved in a standard diamond formation. Kiet on point, Miller behind him, Davis with the radio, and Sully bringing up the rear with the pig, the M60. We moved slow. One step, listen. Another step, listen. In recon, speed kills. You have to be invisible. But for the first 4 hours, we didn't see a single sign of the NVA. No boot prints in the mud, no broken branches, no cigarette butts, nothing. It was like the valley was empty. But Kiet kept stopping. He would freeze, head cocked to the side, looking up into the canopy. When Miller asked him what he saw, Kiet would just shake his head and sign move. But Davis saw Kiet's hands. They were shaking. This was a man who'd hunted tigers with a bolt-action rifle, been in firefights that would make a civilian wet themselves. And he was shaking. By late afternoon on the second day, we found the first sign that we weren't alone. But it wasn't the NVA. We came across a clearing near a small stream. Had been a campsite once, remnants of a fire ring, flattened grass where bedrolls had been. But the camp hadn't been packed up. It had been obliterated. The bamboo shelters were smashed, not cut. If you've ever tried to break green bamboo, you know it's incredibly resilient. It bends. To snap a stalk thick as your leg requires tremendous force. These stalks were shattered, splintered like toothpicks. Miller signaled for a perimeter. Sully set the M60 on a bipod, scanning the far tree line. Miller and Kiet moved into the center of the camp to investigate. There were no bodies. That was the strange part. Usually, if a patrol gets hit, there are bodies, or at least drag marks where the wounded were pulled away. Here, there was just destruction. Then Miller found the helmet. Standard issue North Vietnamese Army pith helmet, pressed cardboard and resin. It was lying in the mud, half buried. Miller picked it up. The helmet was crushed flat. But it wasn't crushed by a boot or a falling rock. There were puncture marks in the material. Miller wiped the mud away and stared at it. The punctures went all the way through, jagged and deep. He realized with a start that he was looking at a bite mark. He held it up to his own head for scale. The radius of the bite was massive, wider than a human mouth, wider than a tiger's jaw. Whatever had bitten this helmet had applied enough pressure to flatten reinforced cardboard like it was paper. Kiet wouldn't touch it. He stood back, staring at the tree line, eyes wide. He whispered something to Miller. "Ngoi rong." Miller didn't speak the dialect fluently, but he knew enough. It meant people of the forest, or wild man. A local legend, a boogeyman story used to scare children. Miller scoffed. He was a soldier. He dealt in facts, in grid coordinates, in enemy strength reports. "Tiger," Miller whispered back. "Big tiger." Kayat shook his head violently. "No tiger. Tiger eat meat. This thing hate. That's a distinction that sticks with you. Animals kill to survive. They kill to eat or protect their young. But hate? Hate is something else. Hate implies intelligence." Miller pocketed the helmet. He needed evidence, even if he didn't know what it was evidence of. He ordered the team to move out. We needed to find a remain overnight position, a RON site. You don't camp in the valley floor. You move to high ground where you can defend yourself. We humped up the side of a karst ridge, finding a small depression in the rocks that offered cover on 3 sides. As the sun began to set, the jungle changed. If the day was unnaturally quiet, the twilight was oppressive. Shadows stretched out, turning vines into grasping fingers. Temperature dropped, but the humidity stayed, wrapping around us like a wet blanket. We set up claymore mines, directional anti-personnel mines, in a semicircle facing the only approach. Davis wired the clackers, the detonators, and laid them next to his sleeping position. We worked in shifts. One man awake on the radio and watch, the others resting. Sleep in the field is never real sleep. It's a light doze, one ear always open. I've done it 1,000 times. You learn to wake up at the snap of a twig. It was Davis's shift, around 0200 hours. Moon was up, filtering through the canopy, painting the jungle in shades of silver and black. Davis was sitting with his back against the rock face, the handset of the radio pressed to his ear, listening to the static hiss of the frequency. He was scanning the tree line through his starlight scope, early generation night vision. Image was grainy, green and black, full of static and ghosts. That's when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind, a rhythmic, heavy thudding sound. Thump, thump, thump. But the rhythm was wrong for wind, too regular. He took the handset away from his ear and held his breath. Thump, crunch, thump, crunch. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps. And they were close. Davis felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He knew the sound of a patrol moving. Soldiers, even bad ones, try to be quiet. They shuffle. Step lightly. This sound was different. It was heavy, deliberate. It sounded like something that didn't care if it was heard. He reached over and shook Miller's boot. Miller was awake instantly, hand going to the Car 15 across his chest. Davis pointed to the tree line, down the slope, just beyond the range of the claymores. They listened together. The footsteps had stopped. For a long minute, there was nothing. Just the heavy silence of the valley. Then, a sound drifted up from the darkness. A whistle. A simple, 2-note bird call. Who-wit. Miller relaxed slightly. It was a bird. Just a bird. But then Kayat, who was sleeping next to Sully, sat bolt upright. He didn't move for his weapon. He covered his ears. Miller looked at him, confused. He signaled, "What?" Kayat uncovered one ear and whispered, his voice trembling so bad it was barely audible. "Not bird." Miller frowned. He looked back at Davis. They strained their eyes against the darkness, and then they heard it again. Who-wit. But this time the sound didn't come from the trees. It came from the left, closer. And then, a second later, it was answered from the right. Who it? It wasn't an echo. It was two distinct sources. We were being flanked. Miller signaled for everyone to wake up. Sully rolled over, pulling the M60 into his shoulder, the belt of ammunition clinking softly. The team went to 100% alert. Eyes wide, fingers on triggers, adrenaline flooding our systems. We waited for the attack. We waited for the tracers, the RPGs, the screaming charge of the NVA. But the attack didn't come. Instead, the footsteps started again. But this time, they weren't trying to be stealthy. It was a slow, heavy prowl. Crunch. Crunch. It was walking in a wide circle around our position. And the sound, it was bipedal. 2 legs. Not 4. If it was a tiger, it would be stalking low. If it was a bear, it would be shuffling. This sounded like a man. A very large, very heavy man, walking with a gait that crunched through the dry leaves and snapped dead branches with casual force. Davis watched the green glow of his starlight scope. He swept it back and forth across the tree line. The image was blurry, the light amplification struggling with the deep shadows. He saw heat signatures, the glowing white shapes of trees and rocks holding the day's heat. Then he saw something else. Down the slope, maybe 50 meters out, a shape detached itself from the trunk of a massive teak tree. It was tall, taller than a man. It stood upright. In the grainy green phosphor of the scope, it looked like a white pillar. It stood there, perfectly still, staring up at us. Davis blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, a phantom of fatigue. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. The shape was still there. And then, it moved. It didn't walk away. It stepped sideways, behind another tree, moving with a speed that was terrifyingly fast for something that size. It was there, and then it was gone. Movement, Davis whispered, voice cracking. 1 pax, 50 meters, south. NVA? Miller asked, voice tight. Negative, Davis said, swallowing hard. Too big. It was white, Sarge. Miller looked at him like he was crazy. White? You mean a uniform? No, Davis said. I mean, fur. It looked like fur. Miller stared at him, then looked back at Kiet. The scout was curled into a ball, his face pressed into the dirt, muttering a prayer in a language neither American understood. Sully, Miller whispered. You see anything? Negative. Sully grunted from behind the M60. But I hear him. There's more than one, boss. I can hear him breathing. That was the part that chilled me when I read the report. The breathing. In the silence of the valley, they could hear heavy, wet rasps of air, like a large bellows expanding and contracting. It was coming from multiple directions. We were surrounded. But whatever was out there wasn't attacking. It was watching. It was testing the perimeter. Miller made a command decision. No firing unless fired upon. If we opened up, we gave away our exact position to the entire valley. If this was an NVA recon element toying with us, firing was exactly what they wanted. We would wait for dawn. The next 4 hours were the longest of our lives. The sounds continued. The whistling. The heavy footsteps. Occasionally, the sound of a rock being clicked against another rock. Clack, clack. A sound that felt primitive and intelligent at the same time. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the canopy, the sounds faded. The jungle began to wake up. Birds returned, tentatively at first, then louder. The feeling of being watched receded, leaving us exhausted, soaked in sweat, and buzzing with adrenaline. Miller did a perimeter check as soon as there was enough light. He went down to where Davis had seen the shape. He wanted to prove it was a trick of the light. He wanted to find a boot print, a cigarette butt, anything human. He found footprints, but they weren't boot prints. Pressed deep into the soft loam of the jungle floor was a print that looked like a human foot, but distorted. Massive, easily 18 inches long. The toes were splayed wide, digging into the earth for traction. But the heel was narrow, and the stride length between the prints was enormous. Whatever had made this track had legs like tree trunks, and a stride that could cover 6 feet in a single step. Miller knelt there, staring at the print. He touched the edge of it. The mud was still wet where the weight had displaced the water. He looked up the slope at us. Davis was watching him, face pale. Kayat was refusing to look down the hill. Sully was checking the feed tray of his machine gun, looking nervous for the first time since we'd met. Miller stood up. He knew the mission was compromised. He knew we should call for extraction right now. But he also knew the logic of the military. You don't call for an emergency extraction because you found a big footprint. You call it when you're under fire. If he called it in now, they'd be laughed out of the TOC. They'd be the team that got scared of a monkey. He looked at the map. The NVA truck park was only 2 clicks north. We could be there in an hour, verify the target, and call for a standard extract. Get in. Get the job done. Get out. Pack it up, Miller said, voice flat. We're moving. Double time. He tried to sound confident, tried to sound like the professional soldier he was. But as he turned back to the trail, he couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the ones hunting anymore. The footprint pointed north, too. Whatever had been watching us last night hadn't left. It had just moved ahead. It was waiting for us. And as we stepped off into the green gloom, the jungle fell silent again. Not a gradual fade, but a sudden, hard cut. Birds stopped mid-song. Insects ceased their buzzing. The silence dropped like a guillotine blade. Miller tightened his grip on his rifle. He knew that silence now. It wasn't emptiness. It was anticipation. We were walking into a kill zone. We moved out in a standard ranger file, putting distance between us and that footprint as fast as the terrain would allow. If you've never tried to move quickly through primary jungle in Southeast Asia, it's hard to explain the sheer physical misery of it. It's not just walking. It's a constant battle against vegetation that wants to trip you, cut you, hold you back. Those wait-a-minute vines hook into your gear. The humidity sits in your lungs like hot soup, and the ground is a slick slurry of rotting leaves and mud that sucks at your boots with every step. But that morning, the team didn't feel the fatigue. Fear is a hell of a motivator. It dumps a cocktail of chemicals into your blood that sharpens your senses and numbs the pain, at least for a while. Miller kept us moving at a pace that bordered on reckless for a recon element. Usually, you move 10 meters, stop, listen for 5 minutes, then move again. You are a ghost. But Miller knew that stealth was gone. We had been made. The only thing left was speed and violence of action. We needed to hit the objective, verify the intel, and get a bird in the air to pull us out. The jungle around us remained dead silent. That silence is heavier than a rucksack. It presses in on your ears. You find yourself straining to hear anything. A monkey, a bird, the wind. But when there's nothing, your brain starts filling in the gaps. You start hearing things that aren't there. Or worse, you start hearing things that are there, but you can't quite pinpoint them. About an hour into the movement, the terrain began to change. We were moving up the valley floor, heading deeper into the limestone maze. The canopy overhead thickened, turning daylight into a perpetual, gloomy twilight. It felt like walking into a cathedral built by a madman. Massive teak trees shot up 200 feet, their roots twisting like giant snakes over mossy rocks. And all the while, that feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just paranoia, it was a physical sensation. A prickling on the back of the neck, a tightness in the chest. It felt like the jungle itself was leaning in, observing us. Kiet was on point, and he was a wreck. Moving mechanically, his eyes darting left and right, his weapon shaking slightly in his hands. Every time we passed a large tree or a dark cluster of bamboo, he'd flinch. He knew this place, knew the stories, and now he knew the stories were true. He kept making hand signs to Miller, subtle gestures that didn't just mean danger or freeze. He was using signs I'd never seen in any training manual. He was warding off evil. We hit a short halt about 500 meters from the suspected truck park coordinates. Miller signaled for a security perimeter. We dropped to one knee, facing outward, weapons up. The silence was still absolute. Miller pulled out the starlight scope again. It was daytime, but under the triple canopy, the shadows were deep enough that the early generation night vision could still pick up contrast, especially heat. He braced the scope against a tree trunk and started scanning our back trail. He stayed like that for a long time. I watched Davis watching Miller. The RTO was sweating through his headband, eyes locked on the team leader, waiting for the verdict. Finally, Miller lowered the scope. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, or rather, looked at where I would have been if I was there, and gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. He motioned for Davis to come over. I later learned what he saw because he whispered it to Davis, and Davis wrote it down in the margins of his map. Miller had been scanning the ridgeline we had just descended. Through the green washout of the scope, he had seen heat signatures. Not one. 3. They were standing perfectly still amongst the tree trunks, blending in with the vertical lines of the forest. But they were hot. Living things generating body heat. And they were tall. Miller estimated the one in the center was pushing 7 feet. They weren't hiding behind the trees. They were standing between them, watching us. They weren't following us to attack. They were hurting us. Miller decided not to tell the rest of the team. Panic is contagious, and we were already on the edge. He signaled for us to move out. We pushed forward, the ground rising slightly as we approached the box canyon where the NVA were supposed to be hiding their trucks. The tension was ratcheting up so tight, you could practically hear it humming like a high-tension wire. That's when the mistake happened. It was Sully. He was a good soldier, rock solid in a firefight, but the silence was getting to him. We had paused for a water break, just 30 seconds. Sully was pulling rear security, looking into a dense thicket of bamboo, convinced he saw movement. To break the tension, or maybe to signal Kiet without speaking, he whistled. Just a short 2-note whistle. Hoo-wit. It wasn't loud, barely carried 10 meters. But in that dead silence, it sounded like a gunshot. Miller spun around, eyes wide. Furious, he started to bring his hand up to cut his throat, the signal for silence. But he froze. From the thicket Sully was staring at, the sound came back. Woo-wit! It was the exact same whistle, same rhythm, same duration. But the pitch was different, dropped an octave, deeper, throatier. It didn't sound like a bird, and it didn't sound like a human imitating a bird. It sounded like a recording played back at half speed on a reel-to-reel tape. It had a metallic oscillating quality that made my skin crawl just hearing about it. Sully went pale. He backed up a step, his M60 wavering. "That wasn't me," he whispered. "Sarge, that wasn't me." Miller moved to him, grabbing his harness and pulling him back. "I know," Miller hissed. Silence. Absolute silence. We stood there for a minute, weapons trained on the bamboo. Nothing moved. No rustle of leaves, no snapping twigs. Just that heavy, suffocating silence returning. But now we knew. They weren't just watching, they were listening. And they could mimic us. That's a terrifying realization in the field. You rely on sound to identify your enemy. If the enemy can sound like you, or sound like the environment, you can't trust your ears anymore. And if you can't trust your ears in the jungle, you're dead. Miller shoved us forward. We were close to the objective now. The smell hit us before we saw it. It wasn't the smell of unwashed bodies or cooking rice, which is what you usually smell near an NVA camp. It was the smell of diesel fuel, old grease, and something else, something copper and metallic. Blood. Old blood. We broke through the last line of vegetation and found ourselves looking into a wide, natural amphitheater surrounded by sheer limestone cliffs. It was the truck park. Intel had been right. There were 5 Soviet-made Zyl 157 trucks, parked in a rough semicircle under the overhang of the cliff, camouflaged with netting and branches, but from the ground, they were clearly visible. But there were no people. A truck park like this should be a hive of activity. Mechanics working on engines, drivers sleeping in hammocks, guards patrolling the perimeter. There should be noise, clanking metal, shouting voices. Instead, it was a graveyard. We moved in, sweeping the area. The trucks were intact. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. If the NVA had bugged out, they would have taken the trucks. If they had been hit by an airstrike, the trucks would be burning wrecks. But these vehicles were pristine, loaded with crates of ammunition and rice. The keys were still in the ignitions. We approached the lead truck. The driver's side door was open. Actually, it wasn't just open. It was hanging off its bottom hinge, bent outward at a 90-degree angle. The metal around the window frame was crumpled, like something had grabbed the top of the door and peeled it back like the lid of a sardine can. And the inside of the cab was painted red. It wasn't a splash. It was a spray. Dried, black-red blood coated the dashboard, the steering wheel, the windshield. A pair of Ho Chi Minh sandals sat on the floorboard. A rifle, an AK-47, was leaning against the passenger seat. But the driver was gone. No body, just the blood and the ruined door. We checked the other trucks. Same story. 3 of them had their windshields smashed in. Not shattered by bullets, but caved in, as if a massive weight had been dropped on them. The hoods were dented with deep, concave impacts, and everywhere there was blood. Pools of it in the dirt, drag marks leading away from the vehicles and vanishing into the tall grass at the base of the cliffs. It looked like a massacre, but there were no shell casings, no craters, no shrapnel scars on the trees. Whatever had happened here had been hand-to-hand, or hand-to-truck. "Where are the bodies?" Davis whispered. He was standing near the tailgate of the last truck, looking at a streak of dried blood that looked like a handprint sliding down the metal. "There's got to be 20 guys in a unit this size. Where are they?" Miller didn't answer. He was looking at the cliffs above us. The limestone walls shot up 300 feet, sheer and gray, dotted with caves and overhangs, dark mouths opening into the mountain. "They didn't leave," Miller said quietly. "They were taken." Kiet was standing in the center of the clearing, turning in a slow circle. He wasn't looking at the trucks. He was looking at the ground. "This place bad," he said. "Old place, spirit place. NVA come here, wake them up. Now they pay." Miller checked his watch. Late afternoon. We had burned too much daylight getting here. We needed to call in the find, blow the trucks if we could, and get to an extraction point. But as Miller reached for the handset on Davis's radio, the first rock hit. It sounded like a gong, a massive, metallic clang that echoed off the cliff walls. A rock the size of a basketball had slammed into the hood of the truck next to Sully. It crumpled the steel like it was tinfoil. Sully yelled and dove for cover under the truck. "Sniper!" he screamed, confusing the impact for a heavy round. "Negative," Miller shouted. "Rock! It's a rock!" Then the rain started. Not water, stone. From the top of the cliffs, 300 feet up, boulders began to fall. These weren't pebbles dislodged by the wind. These were heavy stones, some 50 pounds or more, being hurled with deliberate force. They crashed into the trucks, smashed into the ground, tore through the camouflage netting. It was a barrage. We scrambled for cover. I dove under the chassis of a Zill, the smell of leaking oil and old mud filling my nose. The ground shook with each impact. This wasn't just gravity. To throw a rock that size, that far out from the cliff face, required strength that no human possessed. It was a display of dominance, the jungle equivalent of a mortar attack, but primitive and terrifyingly effective. "Get on the horn!" Miller roared at Davis over the din of smashing metal. "Call it in! Prairie fire! Get us a bird!" Davis was fumbling with the handset, hands shaking. "I can't get a signal. The cliffs. We're in a dead zone." Of course we were. The box canyon was a natural Faraday cage. We were cut off. The rock barrage lasted for 2 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence rushed back in, ringing in our ears. The trucks were battered, windshields gone, hoods crushed. We crawled out, coughing in the dust that hung in the air. "They know we're here," Sully said, his voice trembling. He was hugging the M60. "They're up there. They're looking right down on us." Miller looked up at the cliff edge. The sun was dipping below the rim, casting long shadows across the truck park. We couldn't stay here. We were sitting ducks in the open, but we couldn't go back into the jungle in the dark. We were trapped. "Perimeter," Miller ordered. "Tight 360. We used the trucks for cover." "Sully, get the gun up on that hood. Key it. Davis, mining. I want claymores covering every approach. Trip flares on the perimeter wire. Move." We worked with frantic energy, men digging their own graves. We set up a defensive position between 2 of the trucks, using the wheels and chassis as a bunker. We ran tripwires in a wide circle around the trucks, rigging them to pop flares if anything crossed the line. We set out the claymores, the front toward enemy lettering, facing the dark tree line and the base of the cliffs. Night fell like a hammer. 1 minute it was dusk, the next it was pitch black. The moon hadn't crested the mountains yet, so the valley was a deep, velvety void. We sat in the dark, listening. The silence was back, but now it was different. It wasn't empty. It was full of soft, wet sounds. We could hear them moving in the grass, not the heavy stomping from the night before. This was slithering, shifting. The sound of bodies moving low to the ground. They were closing the circle. Davis was on the radio, whispering into the handset, trying to bounce a signal off the atmosphere, trying to reach the forward air controller, who should be orbiting somewhere high above the clouds. Covey, this is Vector. We are in contact. Heavy movement. Request immediate extraction. Over. Static. Just static. Then, from the darkness right in front of our position, maybe 20 meters out, we heard it. Who it? Sully flinched, his finger tightening on the trigger of the M60. From behind us, near the cliff wall. "Who it?" From the left. "Who it?" They were talking to each other, coordinating, and the whistles were getting closer. They were collapsing the perimeter. Miller leaned over to me, to where I was in the line, and whispered, "Hold fire. Wait for a target. Do not shoot at shadows." I was staring into the blackness, eyes straining against the dark. I wanted to fire, wanted to unleash the fury of the Car 15 into that grass and make the noises stop, but I held. Then, pop. A tripwire snapped. There was a hiss, and a brilliant, blinding red light exploded into existence as the flare ignited. It swung on its parachute, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and warped against the trees. The red light bathed the clearing in the color of blood. And there it was. Standing just inside the wire, caught in the open by the sudden light, was a nightmare. It stood on two legs, towering over the tall grass. Had to be 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in thick, matted white fur that looked yellow-red in the flare light. Under the fur, you could see ripples of muscle that looked like steel cables. Its arms were long, hanging down past its knees, ending in hands that were disturbingly human but massive, with black hooked claws. But the face froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't a monkey, wasn't an ape. It had a flat face, like a man, but with a heavy protruding brow ridge and a jaw that jutted out, filled with teeth that were too big for its mouth. Its nose was flat, 2 dark slits, and its eyes set deep in the skull, and they didn't reflect the light like an animal's. They absorbed it. It didn't run. It didn't flinch. It stood there, one hand resting on the trunk of a tree, looking directly at us. It looked at the flare, then at the trucks, then right at Miller. There was no fear in its posture, only curiosity, and something else. Recognition. It opened its mouth, and I expected a roar, a primal scream. Instead, from that massive, tooth-filled maw came a sound that I will hear in my sleep until the day I die. It was a voice, not a human voice, but a mimicry of one. A distorted, guttural playback of a sound it had heard recently. "Sarge," it rasped. It sounded like Sully. It was Sully's voice, stripped of emotion, played on a broken speaker. "Sarge," Sully screamed. The M60 roared to life in his hands, the muzzle flash lighting up the night like a strobe light. The tracers hammered into the space where the creature stood, chewing up the tree, shredding the grass. The sound was deafening, a continuous thunderclap that shattered the silence of the valley. Miller was shouting, "Ceasefire! Ceasefire!" But Sully didn't stop until the belt ran dry. When the gun finally clicked empty, the echoes rolled off the cliffs and faded. The flare sputtered and died, plunging us back into darkness. "Did I get him?" Sully gasped, his voice bordering on hysteria. "I had to get him. He was right there." Miller popped a fresh magazine into his rifle. "Reload," he ordered, voice ice cold. "Reload everything." "They're coming." We waited. The smoke from the gun hung low in the air. We listened for a moan, a body hitting the ground, the thrashing of a wounded animal. Nothing. Then, from the darkness, closer this time, we heard it again, a low, rumbling chuckle. And then the voice, mocking us from the void. "Sarge." It came from the left, then from the right. "Sarge." They were all doing it. They were learning, and they weren't hurt. Miller grabbed the radio handset from Davis. "Forget the code," he yelled.
Any station! Any station! This is Recon Team Vector! We are surrounded! We have unknown hostiles! Broken arrow! I say again, broken arrow! Broken arrow! The code for a unit about to be overrun!
It tells every aircraft in the theater to drop whatever they are doing and come to your aid. It's the last cry of a dying team. But as Miller shouted into the mic, I looked at the thermal imager one last time. The screen was blooming with heat. They weren't just in front of us. They were above us. On the cliffs. In the trees. The jungle was alive with white-hot ghosts, and they were all descending on the truck park. The hunt was over. The slaughter was about to begin. It didn't start with a roar or a rush of bodies. It started with silence again. That same oppressive, heavy quiet that had followed us from the landing zone. The jungle held its breath, waiting to see if we would break. Miller kept us tight against the trucks, our eyes scanning the tree line, but nothing moved. The thermal imager was still showing heat signatures up on the cliffs, but they were static now, like sentries posted to watch us die. I've been in firefights where the noise is so loud you can't think, where the air smells like cordite and fear. This wasn't that. This was a psychological siege. They knew we were trapped. They knew we were scared. And they were enjoying it. That voice, Sully's voice, twisted and broken, kept echoing in my head. It wasn't just mimicry. It was a weapon. They were trying to make us doubt our own senses, to make us hesitate when the real attack came. We stayed in that tight perimeter for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. Every shadow looked like a monster. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a footstep. Sully was a mess. He was gripping the M60 so hard his knuckles were white, muttering to himself, his eyes wide and unblinking. Miller was the only one who seemed to be keeping it together. He was moving between us, checking ammo, checking the Claymore clackers, whispering orders. A professional, doing the only thing he knew how to do, manage the chaos. Davis, Miller whispered, crouched next to me behind the wheel of the lead truck. Try the radio again. Different frequency. Try the emergency band. Someone has to be listening. I keyed the handset, listening to the static hiss. It was dead air. The cliffs were blocking everything. Nothing, Sarge. We're in a hole. Signals bouncing right back at us. Miller cursed under his breath. He looked up at the cliffs, then back at the jungle. We can't stay here, he said, more to himself than to me. If we stay here, we die. They'll just pick us off, or wait until we run out of ammo. He was right. We were sitting ducks. But moving meant going back into the green, back into their territory. A choice between a slow death and a fast one. Then, Kiet signaled from his position near the rear axle. He was pointing at something on the ground, near the edge of the perimeter wire. I crawled over to him, keeping low. He was looking at a small, leather-bound book lying in the dirt. It looked old, the cover stained with mold and water damage. It must have fallen out of one of the trucks when the driver was taken. Miller crawled over and picked it up. It was a diary, written in Vietnamese. The handwriting was cramped and frantic. The ink smeared in places. Miller couldn't read it, but Kiet could. He took the book, hands trembling, and opened it to the last few pages. He read in silence for a moment, his face growing paler with every line. What does it say? Miller asked, voice tight. Kiet looked up, his eyes full of a terror I hadn't seen in a man before. He say, they come at night. First one, then many. He say they call names. They call his brother name. But brother dead in Hanoi. He say, white ghost take them. Not eat. Keep. Take. To mountain. Keep, Miller repeated. Keep them for what? Kiet shook his head. He not know. he say. They play with them, like cat play with mouse. Break legs, leave them to scream, to call others. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The mimicry, the voices. It wasn't just to scare us. It was bait. They used the wounded to lure in the healthy. That explained the lack of bodies. They weren't killing them here. They were disabling them and dragging them off to use as lures. We have to move, Miller said, voice hard. Now, we break out to the south. There's a ridgeline 2 clicks out. If we can get to high ground, we might get a signal out. We leave the heavy gear. Rucks stay. Take ammo and water. That's it. Desperate plan. Abandoning gear is a cardinal sin in recon, but wait meant slow, and slow meant dead. We stripped our rucks, stuffing magazines into cargo pockets, grabbing canteens. Sully didn't want to leave the extra belts for the M60, but Miller made him. You can't run with 3,000 rounds, Sully. Take what's on the gun and 2 belts. Move. We moved out in a tight diamond, Kiet on point again, though he looked like he was walking to his execution. We didn't go back the way we came. We cut straight for the southern edge of the canyon, hoping to find a game trail or a wash that would lead us up the slope. The moment we left the cover of the trucks, the feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance. The thermal imager was useless now. The jungle was too dense. The heat signatures too scattered. We were blind. We made it about 200 meters before the first attack came. It wasn't an ambush in the traditional sense. No gunfire, no explosions. Just a sudden violent motion in the canopy above us. A massive branch, thick as a telephone pole, came crashing down directly on top of our formation. It missed Miller by inches, slamming into the mud with a sound like a bomb going off. We scattered, diving for cover. Tree bursts, Sully yelled, thinking it was artillery. No, Miller shouted. They threw it. Move, keep moving. We scrambled up, pushing through the vines. Behind us, we heard the heavy rhythmic thudding of footsteps. They were chasing us, and they were fast. I could hear them crashing through the brush, snapping saplings like twigs. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. This was a pursuit. We hit a patch of elephant grass, the tall, razor-sharp blades cutting at our faces. Visibility dropped to 0. You could see maybe 3 feet in front of you. It was a nightmare, running blind in a sea of green, hearing the monsters closing in on all sides. Sarge. The voice came from right beside me, in the grass. It was Sully's voice again. Help me, Sarge. Legs broke. I spun around, raising my rifle. Sully. But Sully was 10 feet ahead of me, running. The voice was coming from the grass to my left. Low. Wet. Pleading. Please. Hurts. I hesitated. That hesitation almost killed me. A white arm, thick with muscle and matted fur, shot out of the grass. It grabbed my ankle and yanked. I hit the ground hard, wind knocked out of me. I was being dragged backward, sliding through the mud. I kicked out, boot connecting with something hard and hairy. I screamed, twisting around, firing blindly into the grass. The creature let go. I scrambled back to my feet, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Contact! Left flank! I screamed. Miller was there in a second, grabbing my harness and hauling me forward. Don't stop! Don't look at it! Run! We burst out of the elephant grass and into a rocky ravine. The ground was slick with moss and water. We scrambled up the other side, slipping and sliding. Kiet was at the top, pulling us up. We were gasping for air, lungs burning. Where are they? Sully wheezed, looking back down into the grass. We listened. The crashing had stopped. The voices had stopped. The silence was back. "They're flanking," Miller said, wiping sweat and mud from his eyes. "They know where we're going. They're cutting us off." He was right. They knew the terrain better than we did. Apex predators in their own backyard. We were just clumsy tourists. We pushed on, climbing higher. The air got thinner, cooler. Vegetation began to thin out, replaced by jagged limestone rocks and stunted trees. We were reaching the upper slopes of the karst. If we could get to the top, we might have a chance. But the creatures weren't done with us. We were crossing a narrow saddle between two peaks when we saw them. Not one, not two, a whole pack. They were moving along the ridgeline parallel to us, maybe 400 meters away. In the moonlight, they looked like white ghosts, leaping from rock to rock with impossible agility. I counted 5 of them. They weren't looking at us. They were moving ahead of us, sprinting toward the pass we needed to cross. "They're cutting off the exit," Miller said, voice flat. "They're boxing us in." We stopped. We couldn't beat them to the pass. They were too fast. And we couldn't go back down. We were trapped on the ridge. "What do we do?" Davis asked, voice trembling. "Sarge, what do we do?" Miller looked around, eyes scanning the terrain. He pointed to a rocky outcrop about 100 meters up the slope. It was a natural fortress, a cluster of boulders with a sheer drop on 3 sides. "We make a stand," Miller said. "We get to those rocks. We dig in. We hold them off until dawn. If we survive the night, maybe we can get a bird in." It wasn't a great plan. It was a suicide pact, but it was the only option we had. We sprinted for the rocks, legs burning, chests heaving. We scrambled up the last few feet of loose shale and threw ourselves behind the boulders. It wasn't much cover, but it was better than nothing. We set up a perimeter, Sully taking the only approach route with the M60, Miller and Kiet covering the flanks, Davis and I in the center with the radio. "Davis, get that radio working," Miller ordered. "I don't care if you have to climb a tree. Get me a signal." Davis started working on the radio, pulling out the whip antenna, checking connections. I watched the ridgeline. The creatures had stopped moving. They were gathering near the pass, dark shapes against the moonlit sky. They were waiting. Then, something happened that changed everything. Below us, in the valley we had just left, we saw movement. It wasn't the white things. It was a line of dark shapes moving quickly through the trees. Soldiers. A squad of NVA regulars, moving in a tactical column. "NVA," I hissed. 6 o'clock low. Miller crawled over to look. We watched them through the scope. They weren't hunting us. They were running, moving with the same desperate haste we had just used. They were looking over their shoulders, weapons pointed back into the jungle. "They're running from them too," Miller whispered. As we watched, one of the white shapes detached itself from the shadows near the pass and leaped down the slope toward the NVA squad. It moved with terrifying speed, a blur of white motion. It hit the rear of the column like a freight train. We heard the screams even from up here. The NVA soldiers opened fire, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness. But the creature didn't stop. It waded into them, swinging those massive arms. We saw bodies flying through the air. We saw men being picked up and thrown against trees. It was a massacre. And then the other creatures joined in. They came down from the ridge like an avalanche. The NVA squad dissolved in seconds. The firing stopped. The screaming stopped. Silence. We stared in horror. These were heavily armed soldiers, veterans of a brutal war, and they had been wiped out in less than a minute. The creatures weren't just strong, they were invincible. "They're not hunting us," Kayat whispered, eyes wide. They hunting everything. This their mountain. We just meet. Miller grabbed Davis by the shoulder. Tell me you got something. I got static, Sarge, Davis said, panic rising in his voice. Just static. I think the radio took a hit when we were running. The handset cable is frayed. Miller swore. Fix it. Splice it. Do whatever you have to do. While Davis worked on the radio, I watched the valley below. The creatures were moving again. They were gathering around the bodies of the NVA soldiers. I thought they were going to eat them. But they didn't. They were picking them up, dragging them. They were taking them away, back toward the caves and the cliffs. They keep them, Kiet murmured. Like diaries say, keep them. Then, one of the creatures stopped. It stood up, sniffing the air. It turned its head slowly, looking up the slope, looking right at us. It let out a roar that shook the rocks around us. It wasn't a challenge this time. It was a primal challenge, a declaration of war. It started up the slope. The others followed. They were coming for us. Here they come, Miller yelled. Sully, get ready. Short bursts. Make every round count. Sully racked the bolt on the M60. Come on, you ugly bastards, he screamed. Come and get some. I checked my ammo. 4 magazines left. That was it. If they rushed us, we'd be out of ammo in 5 minutes. I looked at Miller. He was calm, focused. He caught my eye and gave me a grim nod. If they get close, he said quietly, don't let them take you. You understand? Don't let them take you. I nodded, gripping my rifle. I knew what he meant. I had seen what they did to the trucks. I had heard what the diary said. Death was better than being taken to those caves. The first creature hit the perimeter wire we had hastily strung up. A trip flare popped, bathing the slope in red light. There were dozens of them, a sea of white fur and muscle surging up the hill. Open fire, Miller roared. We unleashed hell. The M60 chugged, spitting brass and lead. The Car-15s barked. We poured a wall of fire into the charging pack. I saw rounds hitting them, puffing fur, splashing dark blood. They flinched, they stumbled, but they didn't stop. They absorbed the punishment and kept coming. One of them leaped over a rock, clearing 20 feet in a single bound. It landed 10 feet from Kiet. Kiet fired his rifle from the hip, hitting it square in the chest. The creature roared and swiped at him. Kiet ducked, rolling away, but the creature was fast. It grabbed his leg. Kiet! I screamed, turning my fire on the beast. I put 3 rounds into its head. It jerked back, releasing Kiet, and slumped to the ground. But before Kiet could scramble back, another one was on him. This one didn't swipe. It grabbed him by the vest and lifted him into the air like a doll. Kiet screamed, thrashing, trying to bring his weapon to bear. The creature looked at him, its eyes cold and intelligent. Then, with a sickening snap, it broke his back. It didn't kill him. It just paralyzed him. It threw him over its shoulder and turned, running back down the slope. No! Miller yelled, jumping up. He fired at the retreating creature, but it was already disappearing into the dark. We heard Kiet's voice fading away down the mountain. Miller! Miller! Help me! And then, a second later, from the darkness closer to us, a voice answered. Miller! Help me! It was the mimicry again. They were mocking us with our friend's dying pleas. We fell back to the rocks, devastated. We had lost Kiet. And the pack was still coming. They had tested our defenses, taken one of us, and now they were regrouping for the final assault. "Davis," Miller shouted over the gunfire. "Status." "I got it," Davis yelled, holding up the handset. "I got a carrier wave." "I think I can transmit." "Call it," Miller screamed. "Call it all. Napalm, high explosive. Drop it on our heads if you have to." Davis keyed the mic, voice cracking with fear and desperation. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Recon Team Vector. We are under heavy attack." Grid coordinates. Bravo. Sierra. 4. Niner. We need immediate air support. Broken Arrow. Broken Arrow. There was a pause, a long, agonizing silence filled with static. Then, a voice cut through the noise. Clear. Calm. American. "Vector, this is Sandy Lead. We read you 5 by 5. We are inbound. ETA 2 mics. Keep your heads down, boys. The cavalry is coming." 2 minutes. It sounded like nothing. But in a firefight, 2 minutes is a lifetime. We looked at the slope. The white shapes were massing again. They knew time was running out. They were going to hit us with everything they had. 2 minutes, Miller yelled. "Hold the line! For Kiet! Hold the line!" We braced ourselves against the rocks, weapons hot, hearts pounding. The final wave was coming. And this time, they weren't going to stop until every one of us was dead or taken. I looked at the darkness, listening to the voices calling from the void. My own voice was among them now, whispering my name. They knew who I was. They knew all of us. And they were hungry. They were hungry, but they weren't mindless. That was the detail that gnawed at me as I crouched behind the rocks, listening to the chorus of mimicked voices drifting up from the dark slope. Animals attack out of instinct. They charge when they smell blood, or when they're cornered. But these things, they were probing, testing the line, waiting for the exact moment when our fear outweighed our discipline. The voice of Kiet, broken and pleading, mixed with my own name being whispered back to me, creating a psychological cacophony designed to break a man's mind long before his body. "Miller," I whispered, keeping my eyes locked on the tree line below. "What's the play if Sandy gets here and can't see us? We're under the canopy. If they drop napalm, we cook." Miller was reloading a magazine, fingers moving with mechanical precision despite the tremor I could see in his hands. "We mark the target," he said, voice flat. "We use the last of the flares. If that doesn't work, we use the strobe." The strobe light. A small, battery-operated distress beacon carried by pilots and recon teams. It flashed a high-intensity xenon pulse that could be seen for miles. But turning it on in the dark was like lighting a flare in a movie theater. It would tell the pilots exactly where we were. It would also tell the creatures exactly where to strike. 2 minutes, Davis muttered, staring at his watch. 1 minute, 45 seconds. The jungle below us erupted again. This time it wasn't a charge. It was a barrage of sound. They started shaking the trees. It sounded like a hurricane hitting the forest floor. Massive teak trees, older than any of us, groaned and cracked under the assault. The canopy swayed violently, shedding leaves and branches that rained down on our position. It was a display of raw kinetic power, meant to terrify us into running. And it was working. Sully was curled into a ball behind the M60, muttering a prayer, his eyes squeezed shut. "Sully!" Miller barked, kicking his boot. "Eyes open! If they breach the wire, you cut them down! Do you hear me?" Sully nodded, but he didn't look reassured. He looked like a man who had already accepted his own death. Then the shaking stopped. The voices stopped. The silence returned, sudden and absolute. It was worse than the noise. The noise meant they were posturing. The silence meant they were moving. "They're flanking," I said, swinging my rifle to the left. "They're coming up the sides. Check your sectors," Miller ordered. "Don't let them get behind us." I crawled to the edge of the outcrop, peering down into the ravine that ran along our left flank. It was a deep, jagged scar in the earth, filled with shadows so thick they looked like ink. I couldn't see anything, but I could smell them. That musk, rotting meat and wet fur, drifted up on the night breeze. It was stronger now, closer. A rock clattered loose below me. I tensed, finger taking up the slack on the trigger. Something white moved in the darkness. Just a flash. A limb reaching for a handhold. "Contact left," I yelled, firing 2 rounds into the shadow. The muzzle flash illuminated the ravine for a split second. In that strobe light instant, I saw it. It was clinging to the vertical rock face like a gecko, its massive hands digging into the stone. It looked up at me, baring those yellow, oversized teeth. It wasn't angry. It looked eager. It launched itself upward, not climbing, jumping. It cleared 10 feet of vertical rock in a single bound, landing on a ledge just below my position. I fired again, hitting it in the shoulder. The round punched a hole in the white fur, spraying dark blood, but the creature didn't even slow down. It roared, a sound that vibrated in my chest cavity, and swiped at me. I threw myself backward, the claws missing my face by inches. The wind of its passing felt hot and wet. I scrambled back toward the center of the perimeter, shouting for help. "Sully!" Traverse left. Miller screamed. Sully swung the big gun around, the barrel spitting fire. The heavy 7.62 rounds hammered into the creature just as it crested the lip of the outcrop. It absorbed 3, 4, 5 hits. Chunks of flesh and fur blew off its chest. It staggered, roaring in pain, but it didn't fall. It lunged forward, grabbing the barrel of the M60 with one hand. I heard the hiss of searing flesh as its palm burned on the hot steel, but it didn't let go. It yanked the machine gun upward, lifting Sully off the ground with it. "Let go!" Miller shouted, firing his CAR-15 into the creature's face. Sully let go, dropping back to the rocks. The creature tossed the M60 aside like a toy. It stood there, looming over us, bleeding from a dozen wounds, breathing heavily. It looked at Miller. Then it looked at me. It was going to kill us. I knew it. There was no way to stop it. We had hit it with everything we had, and it was still standing. Then, a sound cut through the night, a low, growing rumble that shook the ground beneath our feet. It wasn't a roar. It was an engine. The creature froze, its head snapping up toward the sky. Its ears twitched. "Fast movers," Davis screamed, pointing up. 2 A1 Sky Raiders roared over the valley, their engines screaming at full throttle. Flying low, just above the canopy, their navigation lights blinking in the dark. The sound was deafening, a glorious, mechanical thunder that drowned out the jungle. The creature snarled at the planes, confusion flickering in its eyes. It swiped at the air, as if trying to swat them down. "Davis! Pop the strobe!" Miller yelled. Davis fumbled with his gear, pulling out the small strobe light. He clicked the switch. A blinding, pulsing white light began to flash, cutting through the darkness like a lighthouse beam. "Sandy lead. This is Vector," Davis screamed into the radio. "Visual on strobe. Danger close. Repeat, danger close. Drop it on the wire." The radio crackled. "Copy. Vector. Tally on the strobe. Keep your heads down. We're coming around." The creature realized what was happening. It looked back at us, its eyes narrowing. It knew the noise in the sky was a threat, and it knew we were the cause. It roared again, a sound of pure hatred, and charged Miller. Miller didn't run. He stood his ground, firing his last magazine into the creature's chest. The rounds hit home, slowing it down, but momentum carried it forward. It slammed into Miller, knocking him backward into the rocks. The rifle flew out of his hands. "Sarge!" I yelled, scrambling toward them. The creature pinned Miller to the ground, one massive hand on his chest. It raised its other hand, claws extended, ready to tear him apart. Miller reached for his combat knife, pulling it from his sheath. He stabbed the creature in the forearm, burying the blade to the hilt. The beast howled, but it didn't let go. It lowered its face to Miller's, opening its jaws. I could see the strings of saliva, the rows of jagged teeth. Then the world turned into fire. The first Sky Raider dropped its payload. Napalm canisters tumbled through the air, end over end. They hit the tree line just below our position, right where the main pack was massing. The jungle exploded. A wall of liquid fire erupted upward, consuming the trees, the vines, and the darkness. The heat was intense, a physical blow that singed my eyebrows and sucked the oxygen out of the air. The night turned into day, a hellish orange-red day. The creature on top of Miller flinched. The heat and the sudden light terrified it. It looked back at the fire, its primal instincts taking over. Fire meant death. Fire meant run. It released Miller and scrambled backward, shielding its eyes. It looked at the burning jungle, then back at us. For a second, I thought it would attack again. But the roar of the second plane coming in for a run broke its nerve. It turned and leaped off the outcrop, vanishing into the ravine. "Miller!" I grabbed him, pulling him up. "Are you hit?" He was gasping for air, clutching his chest. His flak vest was shredded, claw marks gouged into the ceramic plates. I'm good," he wheezed. "Check the others." Sully was curled up near the rocks, shaking uncontrollably. Davis was still on the radio, guiding the planes. "Good hit! Good hit!" Davis was yelling. "Burn 'em! Burn 'em all!" The second plane dropped its load. Another wall of fire joined the first, creating a ring of flame around the base of our hill. We could hear them now. The screams. Not mimicked voices. Real screams. The sounds of animals dying in the fire. It was a horrible, high-pitched shrieking that cut through the roar of the flames. We watched from the rocks, bathed in the flickering orange light. The heat was unbearable, but it was keeping them back. The fire was our wall. "Look," Miller said, pointing down the slope. In the light of the napalm we saw them, a troop of them, maybe 20. They had retreated from the fire line and were gathering at the edge of the trees, watching the flames. They stood on two legs, their white fur stained with soot and blood. They weren't running in panic. They were watching, observing. They stood shoulder to shoulder, like a regiment of soldiers, staring into the inferno. One of them, larger than the rest, the Alpha, stepped forward. It looked up at the circling planes, then up at us on the rocks. It raised its head and let out a long, mournful howl. It wasn't a challenge this time. It sounded like a signal, a retreat order. The pack turned as one and melted back into the darkness, moving away from the fire, away from us, deeper into the mountains. "They're leaving," I said, slumping against a rock. "They're actually leaving." "For now," Miller said, retrieving his rifle. The barrel was bent, crushed by the creature's grip. He threw it aside and pulled his .45 .45 pistol. "They'll be back. Once the fire dies down, they'll be back." The radio crackled again. "Vector, this is Sandy Lead. We're Winchester on ordnance. We've got a slick inbound for extraction. ETA 5 mics. Pop smoke when you hear him." "Copy, Sandy," Davis said. "We'll be waiting." 5 minutes. We just had to survive 5 more minutes. But the jungle wasn't done with us yet. As the fire raged below, the wind shifted. It blew the thick black smoke up the slope, engulfing our position. We were coughing, eyes watering, blinded by the soot. And in the smoke I heard it again. Miller. It wasn't coming from the jungle. It was coming from the ravine right next to us, the one the creature had jumped into. Miller spun around, aiming his pistol into the smoke. "Show yourself!" A shape emerged from the haze. It wasn't the monster. It was Kiet. He was dragging himself up the rocks, his legs useless, trailing behind him like dead weight. His face was a mask of blood and dirt. His uniform was torn to shreds. "Kiet." I started to move toward him. "Stay back," Miller shouted, holding out an arm. I looked at Miller, confused. "It's Kiet. He's alive. Look at him," Miller hissed. I looked closer. Kiet was crawling, but his movements were wrong, jerky, unnatural, and his eyes were wide and staring, but there was no recognition in them. He was looking through us. "Miller." Kiet's mouth moved, but the voice didn't match the movement of his lips. The sound was coming from behind him, from the darkness of the ravine. "Miller, help me." It was a puppet show. Something was in the ravine, just out of sight. It was pushing Kiet up the slope, using him, baiting us one last time. "Don't touch him," Miller said, voice trembling. "It's a trap. We can't leave him," I yelled. "He's right there." Kiet reached out a hand, his fingers clawing at the stone. "Help. Please." Then, from the smoke behind Kiet, a white hand appeared. It grabbed Kiet by the ankle and yanked him backward. Kiet didn't scream. He just slid back into the fog, his eyes locking onto mine for one terrified second before he vanished. "No!" I lunged forward, but Miller tackled me. "He's gone!" Miller screamed in my face. "He's gone! You go down there, you die! Is that what you want? You want to end up like him?" I struggled against him, tears streaming down my face mixed with soot. "We left him. We left him behind. He was dead before he hit the ground." Miller yelled. "That wasn't him. That was them." We lay there on the rocks, gasping, listening to the silence that followed. No more voices, no more screams, just the crackle of the fire below. Then we heard the most beautiful sound in the world. The thwop 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 of a Huey rotor blade cutting through the smoke. The extraction bird came in low, its searchlight cutting through the haze. It hovered over the outcrop, the side gunners leaning out, M60s trained on the tree line. They dropped a jungle penetrator, a heavy anchor on a cable, down to us. "Go!" Miller hauled Sully up and clipped him onto the cable. "Get him up!" The winch whined, lifting Sully into the air. He was limp, staring blankly at the sky. Next went Davis. He clutched the radio like it was a lifeline. Then it was my turn. I clipped onto the seat, the metal digging into my legs. As the cable went taut and lifted me off the rocks, I looked down. Miller was the last one on the ground. He stood there alone, pistol in hand, watching the ravine. He wasn't looking at the helicopter. He was waiting. As I rose into the smoke, I saw movement in the ravine. A white shape stepped out onto the ledge where Kiet had been. It stood tall, unbothered by the smoke. It looked up at Miller. Miller raised his pistol. He didn't fire. He just held it there, a silent standoff between two predators. The creature didn't attack. It watched. It watched as the cable came back down for Miller. It watched as he clipped in. It watched as he rose into the air. And as Miller cleared the rocks, dangling in the void, the creature raised its head and let out a sound that wasn't a roar and wasn't a mimicry. It was a laugh. A low, guttural, human-sounding laugh. It knew. It knew we were leaving. It knew it had won. It had taken our ground, taken our friend, and broken our spirit. We were escaping with our lives, but we were leaving a piece of our souls on that mountain. I watched Miller hanging there, spinning slowly in the rotor wash. He was firing his pistol now, wild shots into the canopy, screaming into the wind. But the bullets hit nothing but leaves and smoke. The white thing was gone. It had faded back into the jungle, back into the silence, waiting for the next patrol, the next war, the next set of trespassers who thought they owned the night. As the chopper banked away, leaving the burning valley behind, I looked back one last time. The fires were dying down, the darkness was reclaiming the mountain, and somewhere in that darkness, Kiet was still waiting, and the white things were waiting with him. The flight back to base was silent. No one spoke. No one celebrated. We sat on the floor of the Huey, shivering despite the heat, listening to the hum of the transmission. I looked at my hands. They were covered in soot and dried blood. I tried to wipe them clean on my pants, but the stain wouldn't come off. It felt like it was tattooed into my skin. When we landed at the forward operating base, the medics were waiting. They rushed Sully off on a stretcher. Davis was led away by an intelligence officer. Miller and I stood on the tarmac, watching the sun come up over the horizon. It was a beautiful sunrise, full of oranges and purples. It looked like the world was burning. An officer, a major with a clipboard, walked up to us. He looked clean, well rested. He looked at our torn uniforms, our 1,000-yard stares, and frowned. "Report, Sergeant," the major said. "What happened out there? Where's your scout?" Miller looked at the major. He looked at the jungle in the distance. He took a long, slow breath. "Tiger, sir," Miller said, voice devoid of emotion. "Big tiger. Ambush. We lost the scout. Enemy contact minimal." The major blinked. "A tiger? You called in a broken arrow for a tiger?" Miller didn't answer. He just walked past the major, heading for the debriefing tent. I followed him. We signed the papers. We swore the oaths. We buried the truth under layers of redaction and classified stamps. Officially, Recon Team Vector had engaged a superior NVA force and taken casualties. Officially, Kiet was killed by small arms fire. Officially, the white things didn't exist. But I know. Miller knows. And every night, when I close my eyes, I hear the whistle. Who-wit? And I hear the voice calling my name from the dark. "Miller. Help me." The war ended years ago. The jungle has grown back over the bomb craters. The trucks rust in the valley. But some things don't end. Some things just wait. And I know, with a certainty that freezes my blood, that if you go to that valley today, stand in the silence, and listen, you'll hear them. They're still there. And they're still hungry. The extraction bird banked hard to the west, the fuselage vibrating as the pilot pushed the collective down, desperate to put distance between us and that valley. The open door framed a receding nightmare, orange flames licking at the base of the cliffs, black smoke spiraling up to choke the moon, and the vast, unbroken darkness of the jungle swallowing it all. I sat on the floor of the cargo bay, legs dangling over the edge, staring back until my eyes burned. The wind whipped at my face, drying the sweat and blood into a tight mask, but it couldn't scrub away the feeling of those eyes watching us leave. We were loud. We were fast. We were armed with the best technology the United States military could provide. But up there, thousands of feet above the canopy, I felt small. I felt like prey that had been allowed to escape because the predator was full. Miller sat opposite me, slumped against the bulkhead. He hadn't said a word since they hauled him in. He was staring at his hands, which were still gripping his pistol so tight his knuckles were white. The barrel was cold now, but I knew his mind was still back on that rock, locked in that silent standoff. He wasn't really here. Part of him was still dangling on that cable, looking into the eyes of something that had laughed at him. Sully was unconscious, sedated by the flight medic who was working frantically on his leg. Davis was curled into a ball, his headset still on, listening to the chatter of the pilots, maybe hoping to hear a voice that wasn't there. The flight back to the forward operating base at Nakhon Phanom, NKP, felt like it took days. In reality, it was less than an hour. When the skids touched the tarmac, the world rushed back in. Not the silent, heavy world of the valley, but the chaotic, noisy world of the war machine. Ground crews swarmed the bird, shouting over the whine of the turbine. Medics rushed Sully off on a stretcher. Intelligence officers were there before the rotors even stopped turning. Their faces grim, clipboards in hand. They separated us immediately. Standard procedure for a compromised mission, especially one involving a broken arrow call. They wanted to know why we had panicked. They wanted to know why we had burned millions of dollars in ordnance on a patch of empty jungle. I was taken to a small debriefing room, a canvas tent with a single light bulb hanging from a wire, buzzing like an angry hornet. A major I didn't recognize sat across from me at a folding table. Clean-shaven, uniform crisp, smelling of starch and coffee. He looked at me like I was a specimen in a jar, something dirty and broken that he had to categorize before he could throw it away. "State your name and rank for the record," he said, clicking a pen. I told him. My voice sounded raspy, foreign to my own ears. "Tell me about the contact," he said, not looking up. "The pilot reported you requested napalm on your own position. He said you were screaming about being overrun, but the after-action report from the fast movers says there were no enemy combatants visible, no tracers, no return fire, just heat signatures in the trees." I looked at him. I wanted to laugh. Wanted to grab him by his starched collar and drag him out to the flight line, point to the claw marks gouged into Miller's flak vest, and ask him what kind of NVA regular did that. But I didn't. I knew how this worked. If I told him the truth, if I told him about the white things, the mimicry, the way they herded us like cattle, he would write me off as combat fatigue. Section 8. I'd be in a psych ward in Honolulu by the end of the week. "It was an ambush, sir," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "They were in the trees, snipers, sappers. They moved fast. We couldn't get a fix on them." The major stopped writing. He looked up, eyes narrowing. "And the scout? Kiet? What happened to him?" I swallowed hard. The image of Kiet being dragged back into the smoke flashed in my mind. The way his body moved. The voice that wasn't his. "He was hit," I said softly. "Small arms fire. He fell into a ravine. We couldn't recover the body." The enemy was closing in. The major stared at me for a long time. He knew I was lying. Or at least, he knew I was holding something back. But he also knew that in a war like this, truth was a flexible commodity. He needed a report that made sense. He needed boxes checked. Dead scout. Ambush. Air support called. Mission failed, but team recovered. It was neat. It was tidy. It didn't involve monsters. "Fine," he said, closing the file. "Get some sleep, Sergeant. You ship out to Okinawa in 48 hours for R&R. Then we'll see where you go from there." They kept us separated for 2 days. I didn't see Miller or Davis until we were loading onto the C-130 for the flight out. Davis looked haunted. He had lost weight, his eyes sunken into dark circles. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared out the window at the jungle rushing by, flinching every time the plane hit turbulence. Miller was different. He was calm, too calm. He sat next to me on the cargo net seats, chewing a piece of gum, reading a paperback novel. But he wasn't turning the pages. "Sarge," I whispered, leaning in so the other guys couldn't hear. "What did you tell them?" Miller didn't look up. I told them what they wanted to hear. Tiger, big tiger, NVA patrol. Confusion in the dark. And they bought it. "They don't care," Miller said, finally looking at me. His eyes were cold, flat. "They just want the paperwork to disappear. They sealed the file, classified, top secret." It never happened. But Kayet is dead. Miller cut me off, voice hard. "He died for his country. That's what the letter to his family will say. That's all that matters." He went back to staring at his book. But I saw his hand. It was trembling, just a little. A microscopic vibration that betrayed the lie. We never talked about it again. Not really. The team was broken up. Davis got out of the army as soon as his hitch was up. He moved to Oregon, got a job as a forestry ranger. Maybe he thought being in the woods would help him conquer the fear. It didn't. I heard he shot himself in a fire lookout tower 5 years later. They said he left a note, but it didn't make sense. It was just a list of names. His name, Miller's name, Sully's name, and Kayet's name, written over and over again until the pen tore through the paper. Sully never walked right again. The doctors saved his leg, but the nerve damage was permanent. He spent the rest of his life in and out of VA hospitals, telling anyone who would listen about the white demons in the trees. Most people thought it was the drugs talking, or the trauma. But I knew. And Miller? Miller stayed in. He was a lifer, remember? He did 2 more tours. Got promoted. Got medals. Became a legend in the Special Forces community. The man who couldn't be killed. But I heard stories. Rumors from guys who served with him later. They said he changed. Requested odd assignments. Solo recon missions. Deep penetration patrols in areas where no one else wanted to go. They said he was looking for something. 10 years after the war, in 1985, I got a package in the mail. No return address. The postmark was from Bangkok, Thailand. Inside was a small, leather-bound book. Stained with mold and water damage, the pages stiff and brittle. It was the diary. The NVA diary we had found in the truck park. There was a note clipped to the front cover. It was in Miller's handwriting. Just 3 words. I found them. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at that book, hands shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I didn't want to open it. Wanted to burn it, throw it in the trash and pretend I had never seen it. But I couldn't. I had to know. I hired a translator, a former ARVN officer who ran a grocery store in Little Saigon. Didn't tell him where I got it, just told him it was a war souvenir. He took one look at it and crossed himself. He didn't want to read it, said it was bad juju. But money talks. He translated it for me, page by grim page. It was the journal of a North Vietnamese captain named Nguyen. He had been tasked with setting up the truck park in the valley. The entries started normally enough. Logistics, troop morale, complaints about the rain. But then they changed. Day 4, the men are nervous. They say the jungle is watching us. 2 sentries disappeared last night. No shots fired. No tracks. Just gone. Day 6, we found PVT Lin. He was in a tree 50 meters up. His legs were broken. He was alive. He said the white ghost put him there. He said it whispered to him all night. It knew his mother's name. Day 9, they are not animals. They are devils. They took the trucks apart. They threw rocks at us. They laugh in the dark. I have ordered a withdrawal, but the pass is blocked. We are trapped. Day 12, everyone is gone. I am the last one. I am hiding under the truck. I can hear them calling me. They are using Lin's voice. They say they forgive me. They say I should come out and play. I have one grenade left. I will not let them take me. The last entry was just a scribble, a jagged line where the pen had dragged across the page, likely as he was pulled out from under the truck. But there was something else in the package. Tucked into the back of the diary was a photograph, grainy, black and white, taken with a cheap pocket camera. It showed a clearing in the jungle. In the center of the clearing was a rocky outcrop. And on that outcrop, sitting on a stone like a king on a throne, was a massive white shape. It wasn't looking at the camera. It was looking at something on the ground in front of it. Something that looked like a pile of old rusted gear. Helmets. Flak vests. A crushed radio. And next to the pile was a man. He was old, his hair gray and long, his beard matted. He was wearing tattered rags that might have once been tiger-stripe fatigues. He was kneeling, his head bowed. I looked closer at the man's face with a magnifying glass. It was blurry, distorted by the distance and the grain, but I knew the set of those shoulders. I knew the scar on the left forearm, visible even in the poor light. It was Miller. He hadn't gone back to kill them. He had gone back to join them. Or maybe he had gone back to finish the standoff, to find out why they had let him go. I burned the photo. I burned the diary. I watched the smoke curl up into the sky, just like the smoke from the napalm all those years ago. I tried to tell myself it was a fake, a hoax. Miller was dead. He had died in a helicopter crash in 1982. That was the official report. But I know better. Official reports are just paper. The jungle doesn't care about paper. The war is over for everyone else. It's history. A chapter in a textbook. But for me, it's still happening. Every time I walk into a quiet room, I listen for the breathing. Every time I hear a bird whistle, I wait for the pitch to drop. I've done my research over the years. I've looked into the cryptozoology files, the folklore. They call them the Batutut in Vietnam, the Nuoi Rung, the forest people. In Borneo, they call them something else. In the Himalayas, the Yeti. In the Pacific Northwest, Bigfoot. People think they are gentle giants, hiding from civilization. They're wrong. They aren't hiding. They're waiting. They are territorial. They are intelligent. And they hold a grudge. We went into their house. We brought our noise, our fire, our war, and we insulted them. We thought we were the apex predators because we had air support and automatic weapons. But we were just children playing with matches. I think about Miller a lot. I wonder if he's still out there, in that valley that doesn't exist on any map. I wonder if he's still kneeling in front of the White King. Did he make a deal? Did he trade his humanity for answers? Or is he just another trophy? A pet kept to amuse a creature that has lived in those mountains since before we learned to walk upright. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind is howling outside, I think about going back. Not to fight, not to rescue him, just to see, just to know for sure. But then I remember the sound, that laugh, that low human laugh echoing over the rotor wash. And I remember the rule, the one rule that matters in the jungle. You don't go looking for the things that don't want to be found. Because if you find them, it means they wanted you to. And if they want you, they keep you. So I stay here. I lock my doors. I keep a loaded .45 in the nightstand, and I wait. Because I know they haven't forgotten. They mimic us. They learn from us. And if Miller is with them, if he's teaching them, then they know where we live. They know our names. And one night, maybe soon, I'll hear a whistle outside my window. Not a bird, not the wind. Who-wit. And then a voice. My own voice. Or Miller's voice. Or Kiet's. Calling me out to play. That's the thing about war. You think you leave it behind when you get on the plane. You think you wipe the mud off your boots, and that's it. But the mud stains. The blood soaks in. And the things you saw in the dark? They don't stay in the dark. They follow you home. So if you're ever in the woods, deep in the backcountry, and the birds stop singing, if the silence gets heavy, like a blanket, if you hear a footstep that sounds a little too heavy to be a deer, don't look, don't listen, just run. Because they are still there. They are still hungry. And they are waiting for you to make a mistake. This is all I have. The story is told. The file is closed. You can believe it or not. You can call me crazy. You can say it's just a campfire story. But I was there. I saw the white shape in the flare light. I heard the voices. And I know that somewhere in Laos, in a valley of jagged stone and green silence, the war never ended. It just changed sides. Out there on the dark ridgelines, something is still on watch. And it's wearing a green beret,